Imagine living your whole life in a room without windows. Every rule, every belief, every habit is handed to you, and you're told it's the truth. You're never asked what you think. You're only told what to follow. One day, someone opens a door and says, "You can step out and see for yourself." But you hesitate, not because you're locked in, but because you've been conditioned to stay. That hesitation is exactly what Immanuel Kant describes as immaturity. Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, begins with one of the most powerful lines in all of philosophy. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. This single sentence captures an entire worldview, but to really feel its weight, we need to understand what Kant means by immaturity. It's not about age or intelligence, it's about a failure to use one's own reason, especially when that failure is voluntary. It's the refusal to think independently, to ask questions, to take responsibility for one's thoughts and beliefs, and Kant calls it self-imposed, which might sound harsh, but he means it deliberately. He's saying, no one is stopping you from thinking for yourself. The door is open, the chains are gone, but we often prefer the comfort of being told what to do, what to think, what to believe. Why? Kant gives two main reasons: laziness and cowardice. Thinking critically is hard. It demands effort. It's far easier to outsource that effort to authorities, teachers, religious leaders, politicians, even family members, who can just tell us what's right and wrong. There's a strange relief in being led, in surrendering one's intellectual freedom to someone else. But the cost is immense. You remain dependent. You remain immature. Now, Kant wasn't writing this in a vacuum. He lived during the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. This was a time when Europe was beginning to shake off centuries of dogma, when thinkers across the continent were challenging the authority of the church, of monarchies, and of unexamined tradition. Reason was being placed at the center of human life. But even within that movement, Kant noticed something troubling. People still weren't fully free. They still hadn't embraced reason as a personal duty. And that brings us to Kant's call to arms, a phrase that became iconic. Sapere aude, dare to know. This isn't just about collecting information. It's about having the courage to use your own understanding, especially when it's difficult or unpopular. That's the real test. Think about how this applies today. In a world filled with social media noise, political polarization, and inherited ideologies, how often do people really think for themselves? How often do we believe something just because our community believes it, or reject something just because it challenges our comfort? Kant would say, enlightenment begins when we stop doing that. He doesn't stop there. He goes further to make an important distinction between two kinds of reason, public and private. Private reason is what you exercise when you're fulfilling a specific duty in a system. For example, if you're a soldier, you can't decide not to follow orders during a mission just because you disagree with them. If you're a tax collector, you can't refuse to collect taxes because you think the policy is unfair. That would collapse the system. But public reason is something else entirely. It's when you express yourself as a rational being outside of your professional role. It's the space where you write, speak, publish, and share ideas with others, not as a cog in a machine, but as a thinking human being. Kant argues that this space must be absolutely free if society is to progress. So yes, the soldier follows orders on the battlefield, but in civilian life, that same soldier can publish an essay criticizing military policy. The teacher must follow the curriculum in school, but can also write a book questioning that curriculum. This balance is how Kant believes we evolve as a society, by allowing public reason to be free And it's crucial to see what he's doing here. He's not calling for revolution. He's not encouraging disobedience and duty. He's calling for intellectual maturity, an informed, gradual transformation led by thought and debate, not chaos. Now, one might wonder, if enlightenment is so valuable, why don't more people pursue it? Kant says, because it's risky. It requires going against tradition, often standing alone. You might be ridiculed. You might lose social acceptance. Enlightenment demands not just intelligence, but bravery. This is where Kant introduces the concept of guardians, the people and institutions that maintain the status quo. These can be clergy, kings, bureaucrats, or even the educational system. They present themselves as protectors, but in truth, they limit freedom by claiming that the average person isn't capable of thinking for themselves. This message, "You're not ready, just obey," is seductive. It's comforting, but it's also deeply harmful. It keeps people in a state of permanent adolescence. And yet, Kant remains optimistic. He believes that a society can gradually move toward enlightenment, especially if those in power do not interfere with public reason. He points to the example of Frederick the Great of Prussia, who famously allowed his subjects to think and publish freely, even if they were critical of the government or religion. Kant praises this kind of leadership, not because it hands people freedom, but because it gets out of the way. This is a subtle but important point. Enlightenment isn't something given to people. It's something they must claim for themselves. Authority can't bestow maturity. It can only stop preventing it. Now think of this in today's terms. We often demand that governments or institutions give us freedom. But what do we do with that freedom once we have it? Do we use it to question, reflect, improve our understanding? Or do we retreat into echo chambers, follow the crowd, and let influencers do the thinking? Kant would argue that the Enlightenment is never complete. It's a continual process. It happens each time someone asks, "Is this really true? Can I understand this for myself? What if the answer is different from what I was told?" So let's go back to our image of the young man standing at the edge of the forest. The door behind him leads to comfort and tradition. The path ahead is unclear, even frightening, but it's also full of light, the light of reason. Kant's entire essay is a plea to walk that path, not recklessly, but deliberately, not arrogantly, but with curiosity and courage. He wants each person to stop waiting for someone else to define their life, to stop being passive consumers of ideas, and to become active creators of their own understanding. This is where his message becomes deeply personal. He's not just speaking to kings or scholars. He's speaking to all of us, to the student who hesitates to question a teacher, to the believer who wonders about a different interpretation of faith, to the citizen who sees injustice but doesn't know how to speak up. Kant is telling us, you are capable, but only if you try. By the end of this part, we begin to understand that enlightenment is not a destination. It's a way of being. It's about forming the habit of thinking critically, of listening, reflecting, questioning, and learning. The journey is difficult, but Kant assures us, once the seed of reason is planted, it's hard to kill. Minds, once awakened, tend not to go back to sleep. In the previous part, we explored Kant's bold definition of enlightenment, the act of emerging from our self-imposed immaturity. We saw how he urges us to think for ourselves and dares us to know, sapere aude. But once we accept this challenge, a new question appears. How do we actually begin to think independently in a world that still expects conformity? That's where Kant's argument deepens. He doesn't simply want individuals to wake up. He wants society itself to evolve. And for that to happen, people must be allowed to express their thoughts freely. This is where his powerful defense of public reason becomes crucial. To recall, Kant distinguishes between private and public reason. Private reason is bound by duties, by roles, like a government official, following laws, or a pastor delivering doctrine. In these roles, personal freedom is limited for the sake of social order, but public reason is what a person uses when they communicate as a scholar or citizen in a public forum, writing, speaking, questioning, even criticizing the very rules they follow in their private role. This might sound contradictory, but for Kant, it's the perfect balance. Obey the system in your role, but question it as a thinker. The soldier marches, but he can also write an essay critiquing the war. The priest preaches on Sunday, but he can publish doubts on Monday. Society remains stable, but the thinking behind it evolves. Why is this so important? Because no institution, no belief system, no law should ever become untouchable. When ideas become sacred, they stop growing. Public reason is how we keep them alive. Now, Kant doesn't expect change to come overnight. He doesn't call for immediate rebellion. Instead, he believes in gradual reform. Reform through education, discussion, and reasoned criticism. He's not just describing enlightenment. He's giving us a process to achieve it. But there's a deeper challenge here. Even if we agree with Kant in theory, living as an enlightened person in a society still bound by tradition, dogma, and authority isn't easy. What if you're punished for speaking freely? What if your community turns against you? What if your independence is seen as rebellion? Kant acknowledges this risk, but he believes the long-term benefits outweigh the discomfort. He compares society to a forest. If one tree grows tall and straight, it may stand alone at first, exposed to wind and weather, but eventually, others will follow its example. New growth depends on the first act of courage. He also turns the spotlight on rulers, kings, governments, leaders. His message to them is surprisingly bold. Don't be afraid of reason. A strong ruler, he says, should not fear criticism. In fact, they should welcome it, for if their authority is just, it will stand up to scrutiny. And if it isn't, reason will reveal a better way. Here he praises Frederick the Great of Prussia, who allowed his people to speak and write freely. Under such rulers, Kant believes enlightenment is possible, not just for individuals, but for entire nations. Let's pause here and think about what this really means. Kant is asking for something rare even today, a system where people can both fulfill their roles and question the system, where obedience doesn't kill inquiry, and where leaders are secure enough to allow dissent. This kind of society is hard to build. It requires not only free institutions, but also a culture of trust and patience. Trust that individuals will use their reason responsibly, and patience to let change happen gradually through conversation, not force. And this brings us to another central idea in Kant's essay, the relationship between freedom and order. Most people believe that if everyone does as they please, chaos will follow. That's why so many societies limit free speech or freedom of thought. But Kant flips this fear on its head. He argues that freedom of thought, especially in the realm of public reason, doesn't destroy order. It creates a stronger, more rational order, because when people are allowed to question and improve the system becomes more just. When people feel heard, they're more likely to obey, with understanding, not resentment. Freedom, then, doesn't undermine authority. It legitimizes it. But of course, this kind of freedom requires responsibility. Enlightenment isn't a license to speak recklessly. Kant doesn't want people to spread lies or insults in the name of free thought. He wants honest, reasoned discourse, people using their intellect not to tear down, but to build better ideas. So, the real goal is maturity, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. And yet, Kant warns that many people will resist this. They'll say things like, the general public is too stupid to think for themselves. Or, if we allow free thought, people will rebel. These are the arguments of guardians, the very people who benefit from keeping others in a state of immaturity. Kant calls them out directly. He says, if you claim to be a leader or a teacher, your real job is to help people become independent thinkers. If you keep them dependent on your authority, you're not a leader, you're a jailer. So, how do we break free? Kant's answer is both philosophical and practical. He believes in the slow development of enlightenment through education, public discourse, and courageous individuals who set the example. He's not naive. He knows that people are afraid. They've been taught to obey, not to think. But once a few start using their reason openly, others will follow. The light spreads, and importantly, Kant believes that the process of enlightenment is irreversible. Once people begin to think freely, they rarely return to blind obedience. A society that experiences even a taste of freedom and reason begins to shift in profound ways. Let's think again of the modern world. How often do we face these same tensions? When students question outdated curriculums, when journalists challenge political power, when citizens ask for more transparency, every time this happens, the guardians of the old order push back. They say, stay in your place, trust the experts, don't make trouble. And every time someone responds with a reasoned argument, with thoughtful dissent, they carry forward Kant's vision. We see now that enlightenment is not an individual achievement alone. It is social, it is collective, it is a rising tide of reason that lifts entire cultures, slowly, unevenly, but persistently. And here's something else Kant believed deeply. Human progress is real. Despite the violence, ignorance, and oppression of history, we are moving forward not because we're perfect, but because we are capable of reflection, learning, and growth. The fact that we can ask these questions and try to answer them proves it. This belief in progress sets Kant apart from the cynics of his time, and maybe even from many thinkers today. He is not satisfied with critique alone. He wants reform. He wants light. So what does all this mean for us? It means that every time we read critically, question respectfully, or challenge an idea with reason, we take part in the Enlightenment. Every time we share an idea that goes against the grain, but do so with clarity and calm, we move the world a little closer to maturity. It also means we must resist the temptation to hide behind dogma, whether religious, political, or cultural, not because these things are always wrong, but because unexamined belief is no belief at all. The real mark of an enlightened person is not that they reject tradition, but that they understand it, question it, and adopt it freely if it survives the test of reason. Let's not forget, enlightenment is not about rebellion for its own sake. It's about reason, courage, and dignity. Kant's vision is both challenging and hopeful. He knows we won't all achieve enlightenment at once, but he believes we can create the conditions where more people will dare to try. By now, we begin to see that Kant's essay isn't just a political or philosophical document. It's a guide for living. It asks us to look at ourselves and ask, am I thinking for myself? Do I let others decide for me? Do I have the courage to change my mind when reason demands it? In these questions lies the real journey. Kant's final message is clear. The enlightenment of individuals leads to the enlightenment of humanity. And while this may take generations, it begins with a single step, the decision to think. And so, we leave this part with the image of a society slowly waking up, not through violence or revolution, but through discussion, books, arguments, and examples. A society that is learning not just to obey, but to understand. In the final part, we'll look at the long-term implications of Kant's message. How does enlightenment influence politics, religion, and the future of humanity itself? And what does it mean to live as an enlightened person, not just in theory, but in everyday life? We've traveled far with Kant's short but powerful essay. We've uncovered his central message. Enlightenment is the process of emerging from self-imposed immaturity. We saw how this immaturity thrives, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of a lack of courage. We explored the distinction between private and public use of reason, how we can obey roles, yet still think critically, and we ended with the powerful idea that individual enlightenment leads to collective progress. Now, in this final part, we look outward. What does enlightenment mean for the larger structures that shape human life? Politics, religion, education, authority? What kind of future is Kant pointing us toward? And how do we walk that path, especially in a world still full of control, distraction, and fear? Let's begin where many struggles still lie. Religion. Kant was writing in an age where religion was dominant. Socially, politically, intellectually, people weren't just believers. They were expected to conform to doctrines without question. The church often acted as a guardian, providing moral rules and silencing dissent. To challenge religious authority was dangerous, and yet Kant walks a brilliant line. He doesn't tell people to stop believing in God. He doesn't attack religion itself. What he does is far more radical. He demands that religion open itself to reason. For Kant, true faith is not about blind obedience to a set of rules. That's immaturity. Real religious maturity comes when a believer understands why they believe, when they examine doctrine, question teachings, and accept only what resonates with their reason and moral conscience. In fact, he argues that a religion which fears reason has already lost its moral ground. If your beliefs collapse under questioning, maybe they were never strong to begin with. Kant imagines a church where ministers are allowed, even encouraged, to express doubts publicly, to propose reforms, to question rituals, and still remain loyal to their institution. He sees no contradiction in this. He believes reform comes from within, when thinkers have the freedom to illuminate old truths and discard superstitions. This idea is just as controversial today as it was then, but it shows Kant's deeper vision. Enlightenment does not destroy religion, it purifies it. It brings it closer to reason, and thereby closer to true morality. Now let's turn to politics. Kant's political vision is subtle, but clear. He is not calling for revolutions or regime change. He's not asking people to rise up against kings or parliaments. Instead, he asks rulers to allow reason to flourish, to permit criticism, to welcome open discussion, to build systems that don't fear the voice of the people. He praises leaders like Frederick the Great because they do something rare. They allow people to speak, write, and argue even against the state. And they don't see this as a threat, but as a sign of strength. Kant believes that political stability and enlightenment can go hand in hand. A society doesn't need to collapse for it to grow. It just needs to allow its citizens to mature. And how do citizens mature? Through education. Kant sees education not merely as job training or memorizing facts. Real education teaches people to use their reason, to think critically, to analyze arguments, to spot manipulation, and to speak with clarity. In this, he anticipates the modern idea of civic education, an education that doesn't just create workers, but thinkers and participants in public life. But there's a problem we must face here. Even in our time, centuries after Kant, we still live in a world where many people avoid thinking, not because they're stupid, but because thinking is hard. It's uncomfortable. It forces us to challenge our habits, our biases, and sometimes our own identity. So what keeps us from enlightenment today? It's not just religious dogma or authoritarian rulers anymore. It's distraction, endless entertainment, shallow debates, social media outrage, clickbait. We are surrounded by noise, and it's easier to conform to the popular narrative than to pause and reflect. Kant would argue that this too is a form of immaturity. Only now we're choosing it willingly. He would remind us, you are not thinking, you are being entertained. And while there's nothing wrong with pleasure or rest, if it replaces thought, we regress. So what does it mean practically to live as an enlightened person today? It means resisting the urge to follow the crowd blindly. It means asking questions, not to rebel, but to understand. It means accepting that truth is often complex, that answers require effort, and that changing your mind is not weakness, it's growth. It means practicing public reason, not just in academic journals or formal essays, but in conversations, in comments, in daily life. It means using your platform, whatever it is, to contribute to a culture of thoughtful debate rather than shallow noise. It also means understanding that freedom and responsibility are inseparable. You cannot demand the right to speak unless you are also willing to listen. You cannot ask for tolerance unless you give it. Enlightenment is not about winning arguments. It's about becoming wiser. Now let's talk about authority. Political, religious, academic, even parental. Kant isn't asking for chaos. He knows that society needs rules, structures, institutions. But he believes these structures must be open to evolution. Authority must be accountable to reason. If a law cannot justify itself through logic and fairness, it should be challenged. If a tradition harms rather than helps, it should be reformed. If a leader silences questions, that leader has something to hide. True authority, Kant suggests, is not threatened by dissent. It is strengthened by it, because reasoned criticism reveals flaws and allows for improvement. This idea could transform how we think about leadership today, whether it's in politics, religion, or business. The enlightened leader is not the one who demands obedience. It's the one who creates space for growth. And finally, let's return to progress. Kant believes that history moves forward, not in a straight line, but through a constant push and pull between ignorance and reason. He is not naive. He sees how deeply people cling to comfort, how quickly power resists change. But he also believes that enlightenment, once started, is hard to stop. Each generation inherits the gains of the last. Freedom spreads slowly, but it spreads. Institutions evolve, minds open, and the direction of this change is, overall, positive. Yes, there will be setbacks. Yes, there will be new forms of oppression. But the idea of enlightenment, that humans can govern themselves through reason, once introduced, cannot be erased. It's like a flame. You can hide it, you can try to smother it, but as long as someone protects it, it will light new fires. So we come to the end of this journey. Kant's What is Enlightenment is not a long text. It's not filled with complicated jargon or long arguments, but its impact is massive. It gives us a definition of maturity that is both personal and political. It calls us to be more than obedient citizens or passive believers. It asks us to be full human beings, capable of thinking, judging, and choosing for ourselves. And it reminds us that change doesn't come from shouting, but from understanding that freedom is not given, but earned. And that reason, while difficult, is the most human path we can walk. So, if you're watching this now, ask yourself, am I using my own understanding? Do I question with purpose? Do I help others rise? Or do I keep them dependent? Am I contributing to the light or hiding in the dark? Because the Enlightenment isn't over. It's not something that happened in the 1700s. It's happening now. Every time someone thinks for themselves, speaks with clarity, or questions with honesty, the world moves forward. And if enough of us do it, slowly but surely, the whole world grows up. Let that be the legacy, not just of Kant's essay, but of your own life, to leave the world more awake, more thoughtful, and more free than you found it. If this message resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into philosophy, books, and timeless ideas that still shape the present. See you in the next one.